There we go.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Sunday forum today on the second Sunday of Epiphany, the commemoration of life, ministry, and continued legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As you know, I'm one of your pastors. I'm Pastor Sergio Rodriguez. I'm the pastor for Community Ministries. And today I want to talk to you about as one newscaster put it, the kind of the curious story of desegregation in Houston. The basis for my presentation today is really fourfold. It is first off, there's a wonderful documentary that was put out by the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston in 1997. Called The Strange Demise of Jim Crow, Eldrewey Stearns and the Desegregation of Houston. Highly recommended because a lot of the individuals that I'll be mentioning in my presentation today actually were still alive at the time. And maybe all but one actually had a part to play in the documentary. So I highly encourage you to watch this. This is about 56 minutes, so it's not that long, but it is a gold mine. The second one is No Color Is My Kind. It is actually the story of Mr. Eldrewey Stearns. It came out just recently by the University of Texas Publications. Again, if you want to hear about not just simply, and we'll talk about him, I had mentioned him in my sermon, Mr. Eldrewey Stearns, who was one of the catalysts for this TSU sitin movement. It talks about his life, his experience, and then afterwards, kind of the sad story of his own kind of decades after the civil rights movement. It wasn't necessarily the most positive. So it's a really good book to read. I highly recommend it. Another one that I recently read is called Houston Bound: Culture and Color in a Jim Crow City by Tinya Steptoe. It just came out this year, and it's hot off the presses. I cracked it open yesterday, but it is an excellent book if you want to understand about the dynamics of different racial social groups in the city of Houston from the early 20th century to slightly before the 1970s. So you'll see an interesting kind of what is the relationship between Houston, San Antonio, and Shreveport, or Houston and San Antonio and the cultures that comprise Southern Louisiana. And so this whole book really describes how there's this it's not as desegregation occurred in the city of Houston, it was trying to solidify cultural and social relationships that simply were just too difficult to codify because you have people who are mixed race and mixed identities and various identities. And so this book argues that despite these laws, there was a whole cultural wellstream that came about. When you think of Zydeco music and things of that nature, that kind of really resisted a real simplistic way of understanding Houston. And so those are and finally, the last thing is I had a personal interview with Halcyon Watkins. She was born Sadberry, her name at the time when she was at TSU, she was Halcyon Sadberry. She was a sophomore TSU student, and we had this interview on Friday. It was really a blessing. One of my campus ministry friends, Reverend Charles Graves IV, the first, second, the third, the fourth. He is the Episcopal campus minister at Canterbury, Houston, which is a campus ministry that encompasses the whole Houston public university system. And so he happened to know a cousin who happened to know Halcyon, cousin of a cousin. So let me begin by saying that what makes the little title, The Strange Demise of Jim Crow, actually best captures what really happened in the city of Houston between 1959 and 1963, and really about the May of 1963. It was odd in this way that if you know about the history, right, of the civil rights era, think of all the race riots, if you would, Montgomery, Alabama, right? There is a perception that when it came to the issue of desegregation, there was always going to be a violent response. And they required nonviolent demonstrations that had to be met by a violent response. Houston is the major city that resisted, and that didn't occur here. And it didn't occur because that narrative was intentionally in the mind of civic leaders and student leaders during this very short period in the life of Houston itself. And I really want to begin by saying that this is an interesting story because it actually comes from someone who's not really a Texan initially. You have Eldrewey Stearns is from Michigan. Eldrewey Stearns studied in the Michigan State University and decided he wanted to go to law school. And his first site was actually the University of Texas Law School. But sadly, at the time, which was a little bit before '59, they still hadn't admitted Black students yet. There was actually a court case in the Supreme Court that hadn't been litigated yet that actually allowed for the first African American student to be admitted, and that was actually I think the same year of '59, if I remember. And so it's shortly before this time, Eldrewey Stearns matriculates into the Texas Southern University. And being a university law student, right? He needs money to pay for just basic necessities, and so he had connections in the city that allowed him to find it's an interesting kind of a bartending job in some of the nightclubs around town. And so his typical kind of habit was law school in the day, his quote night school, i.e. bartending in the evening. And it was in an evening of August 1959 that Mr. Stearns was coming back from work, and he was stopped for a traffic violation. It was a simple violation, nothing out of the ordinary. At this point, it wasn't. He thought it wasn't necessarily racially profiling. So Mr. Stearns is asked to come out of the vehicle, and he pulls out his wallet, but to his chagrin, what falls out is actually a photo of one of his friends. It's this white woman that he had befriended while he was an undergrad student at Michigan State University. Now, the police officers saw the photo. Their initial response is, oh no, this isn't how it should be. And they proceeded to, this is the phrase I'll use, they put him in his place. This is exactly what they tried to do. They arrested him, brought him downtown, and they beat him. And so subsequent to that, Mr. Stearns was still required to pay for the traffic violation. And he decided at that point, and this is several months later, this is before 1960, so this is about, we're thinking about November, December. He goes before one of the local courts, and he argues, and he makes not only does he argue that this shouldn't have happened, but he tried to draw attention to the fact that he was a victim of this injustice. So at this particular session, he actually managed to get media attention. He had garnered media attention weeks before because he tried to, inform the university that this had happened, inform friends and colleagues. So after this case was litigated, not in his favor, he lost his position. They decided, the club owner said, this is just too much negative press. We don't want to be able to deal with this individual, Eldrewey Stearns. So he was dismissed. And so this is January 1960, and he doesn't really know where he needed to go. So he's looking for employment. And luckily he had a friend who knew the executive director of the Y, the South Central Y, Mr. Quinton Meese, who, upon talking with Mr. Stearns, extended him a job. And it was there that Mr. Stearns was one of the youth directors there for the program that they had at the Y. And it's in this time, I want to just think about it this way, February 1, 1960, 4:30 p.m. Who here was alive in 1960? Right? Do you remember what happened February 1st, 1960? Conceived. We have conception. my father was. So this is 4:30 p.m. 4 students from North Carolina A&M decided to enter a Woolsworth Company luncheon diner and sit They were 4 African-American students: Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Ezio Blair Jr., and David Richmond. And they did so because they felt influenced by what they had seen earlier with Dr. Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolent approaches. And so this really was this is the touchstone for all the citizen movements in our country. It's exactly this particular event.
Where was that?
That was in Woodsboro, North Carolina. And so I mean, days later, right, as Mr. Stearns he's going around studying, he's at the Y. There's fervor at the student union, and particularly the Baptist Student Union at Texas Southern University. What are they going to do? They hear about what these students are doing in Greensboro, and they thought, well, we want to catch that same spirit, but we don't have the training, we don't have the understanding. Shortly before this particular time in February, the Reverend William Lawson, who is the Reverend, right, of who we call the Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church. He was actually a professor at the time of Bible there in Texas Southern University, and he was also called to be the campus minister for the Baptist Student Union. So it's an evening in February, and he notices something odd. The building where the Baptist Student Union is the lights are on. And he realized there was no meeting scheduled for that day. So he decides, I'm going to take a look. So him and his wife, him and Miss Wheeler go inside, and there are all these students, most of them he had never seen. Most of them weren't even Baptist students. The students had gathered to talk about what were they going to do, right? They wanted guidance. And as soon as one of the students that was actually a Baptist saw Reverend Wheeler, they said, come over here. And Reverend Wheeler's like, okay, right. So they have a discussion. What are you doing here? Why are you gathering? What's the discussion about? And they said, we want to find a way, right, to integrate the city of Houston. And we've been hearing about what's been going on with the students at Woodsboro. That movement is growing fast and quickly. What can we do here in Houston? There doesn't seem to be some movement around there. And so Reverend Wheeler recounts how, he questions him. He actually says this in this documentary. He questions him. Are you sure this is what you want? This is sure what you guys are looking for? You realize that you can put your careers in jeopardy. You won't have employment. And the students are like, well, you're either going to help us learn about these processes, or we're just going to go. So they leave the Baptist Student Union. And at that point, right, there's Eldrewey Stearns. The next day, he's talking with Quentin Meese, and Quentin Meese quickly finds out, because him and Reverend Wheeler are friends. He finds out about it. Sorry, Lawson. Him and Lawson are very good friends. And so they immediately find out, oh, there's this movement that's going on, and they're actually looking for a leader, right? And so that the wheels start turning with Mr. Stearns, and he decides he's going to go on campus and find this student group. And he volunteers. I'll be the head. I'll lead this thing. We'll do this. And so this is about mid-February. So from mid-February to about March 4th, 1960, Eldrewey and the students are trying to figure out, how are we going to organize the first sit-in? Where are we going to go? What are we going to target? And what kind of foundation do we need to carry this forward? Because again, the principles are nonviolent protests, right? They needed some form of foundation for them. So the students decided, and I'll give you a list of some of the students. 14 students would lead the charge, one of which was Eldrewey Stearns. And they would do that on March 4th, 1960. This is about a Friday at Wine Gardens. It's about a mile from TSU. It's a lunch counter. It's right now the current location, it doesn't exist anymore. It's actually a post office at 1410 Alameda. And actually 2010, the historical marker from the state was placed there. So you can actually see that. It actually commemorates the TSU sit-ins. So if you want to go, it's 4110 4110 Alameda Road. So please go there. And so the students gathered right at the university flagpole with the Reverend Lawson, and he leads them in a prayer. One of the interviewee, Halcyon Watkins, we talked about this. she reminded me, she said, you know, every time we did something, wherever we had a sit, we always prayed beforehand. She said, I believe in the power of prayer. Even to this day, I believe in the power of prayer, that prayer can transform things and can give us the courage. And that's something that even today, that's her hope is, you know, with the way that things are going in society, the way that there's still movements for justice, we always begin with prayer. Because that's the rock on which we stand. And so these 13 students, let me give you some of their names. So Otis King, who collaborates very closely with Eldrewey Stearns, Lot Burrell, Halcyon Sadbury Watkins, later when she got married, or Dr. Watkins, Dorothea, Mr. Curtis Graves, and then Dr. Earl Allen and Miss Holly Hogobergs. So they arrived there, and initially the 14 students, they fill up all of the counter spaces at the wine garden. And soon after, shortly after, several hours, students start coming in. And by the end of the day, there's about 100 students, right? So what could they do? So wine gardens did what any place in that time would do. They said they didn't want any trouble, they didn't want any situation, so they closed. Which, as we'll find, right, as I'll describe a lot more of these different sit-ins, that is really how the city responded. A lot of these businesses responded. They knew where there's going to be a sit-in, there would be a huge media presence. We're not serving today. We're not, we're closed. That's kind of the response. The problem with this initial sit-in was because of we're just going to close it, there was no violence, there was no media presence, and there was no police presence. So if there's anything you must learn about how nonviolent protests worked during the time of MLK, you needed a violent response in order for the protest to work effectively. Because that in itself showed the truth of the matter asserted, that love itself is the power that can cast away hatred and violence. So wherever there wasn't this kind of violent response, typically the civil rights movement floundered. Because there wasn't the media attention. Media loves these violent moments. That's needed to capture both the sentiment, capture the just the visceral of it, but to really capture the narrative. So when you don't have these institutions to capture the narrative, right? There usually isn't the power to go forward. There isn't the strength to go forward. It doesn't encourage people to join the movement. And I bring that up because that's part of what's going to be the intentional oddity of Houston. Is that is actually the typical Houston response to most of the sit-in movements. The students decide that there are other, at this point, they're going to hit other local institutions around TSU, one of which was a Walgreens that was nearby. And at this point, there's no violent response. Except about 8 days later, there was a student, Mr. Felton Turner, was abducted from TSU sometime in I think it was the early morning, if I remember. And he was taken out to somewhere by two individuals that were masked, white individuals, took him out. They strung him from his legs and they carved in his stomach 2 rows of KKK. And so luckily he managed to leave and he went to the police station and he reported it. This is what happened to me. There's actually some footage. I didn't include that link here, but there's another link I'll include later on with our resources that actually has film footage of that. But what ended up happening is no one ever got charged. So it's no one else who did it. So at this point, Eldrewey Stearns and the students, particularly Eldrewey Stearns and Otis King, decided, we just have ourselves. And no offense to Reverend Lawson, he's great. And we have Mr. Meese, but we need more support. We need a connection to a national organization. So they decide in March 1960, let's just go to the big chiefs. Let's call Martin Luther King Jr. And let's have them, and Mr. Stearns actually relates this in this documentary. He said we were hoping when we were going to call him, to send somebody. To send some individual, his right-hand man, someone else from the NAACP would come. So they give him a call. And Martin Luther King responds by saying, "Thank you, I'm gonna take this up to God." And that's it. They had requested Mr. King to come there and they'll take it up to God. So Eldrewey Stearns and Otis King didn't know what to do, but clearly they weren't going to get that kind of support at this point in the whole thing. So the student movement, right, it's still swelling, it's still growing. They decide they're going to make they're going to finally start to take this downtown. And they're going to stick it to the man. They're going to stick it to Mayor Kirchrow. So they decide March 25th, 1960, there's an ambassador from Argentina, comes and visits the city, and they're like, this is the prime opportunity. So Eldrewey Stearns and some of the students are outside picketing. There's wonderful images of this, desegregate the city now, and Eldrewey said, I'm gonna make a point. I'm gonna go inside that cafeteria in City Hall. And he assumed, right, going inside, they're gonna refuse the service, they're gonna show the Argentinian ambassador, they're gonna shame the whole city. And to his surprise, they served him in the cafeteria. And he had a meal with the people there. Which at the time, right, it seemed to assume, right, okay, maybe the city's gonna integrate much more quickly than we thought. That wasn't the case. So the mayor thought, okay, I need to control this. I need to figure out how to control this and control this quickly. So he decides shortly after this kind of a demonstration, he was going to establish a biracial committee of 37, which included President Samuel Norbert of TSU, 2 other students in TSU, other civil rights leaders. I don't know if you ever got to know the name Felix Tijerina, but he was the chair of the LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which was the Mexican American civil rights movement, which he actually was opposed to a lot of what Eldrewey Stearns was doing. So they were in this committee of 37. And the chair of this was chaired by a lawyer, Leon Jaworski. Mr. Jaworski, he decided he was not in favor of any form of integration. And so him and the mayor informed the students that if they persisted in their sit-ins and in their protests, that they would censure them and they would jail them. Of course, it kind of backfired. On April 25th, 1960, vote came to this biracial committee, and it was proposed that actually, no, we should desegregate immediately. From the way things are going, the way that the responses have been with a lot of these different kind of lunch counters, there hasn't been a violent response. We should desegregate now. There was 19 votes in favor. You almost said yes, and there were 3 against. Obviously, you can guess who was against. Mr. Jaworski was one of them. But the mayor said, I'm not going to have any of this. Immediately dissolve the committee. So the committee immediately dissolves, and we begin to have an impasse. And the impasse, you would assume, doesn't actually continue to go against the mayor's side. And this is the last straw in all of this. May 1960, it's Saturday, weekend of Mother's Weekend. And Eldrewey Stearns had been on the radio informing the Black community, don't go and buy stuff for Mother's Day. We're going to have a protest. It's going to be an economic boycott. We're going to strike it right at the heart of the city. And as you know, Foley's at the time, they were a huge economic powerhouse in the city. I mean, these guys, they controlled, they in terms of like media presence and being able to negotiate for other business leaders, Foley's was at the heart of this. They were the economic, like one of the economic foundations for downtown Houston. And it was effective. No one shopped, and it was an economic blow to the city. And so at that time, Black city owners and white city owners and sympathetic city owners decided we have to figure this out. Right. At this time, there were Black city owners that really bankrolled the sit-ins, right? And they would eventually bankroll these students as they began to be jailed in 1961. You have people like John Coleman, Mark Hanna, A.E. Warner, and Judson Robinson, of course, Mr. Clinton Meese, together with owners, such as, where is it? Bob Dundee's, Bill Wallace, the Mayor Crittrell's part of this, and an important person, John T. Jones, who was the chair of the Houston Endowment, of which owned the Houston Chronicle, and he was actually one of the publishers at the time, John T. Jones. He was the most influential because he was really the middleman between the Black business owners and the white establishment, and the white leadership. So him, together with another entrepreneur, a Black entrepreneur, Hobart Taylor, worked together to find a plan to make sure that the integration of Houston happened quicker. Mr. Bob Dundee's, who really was one of the ones who had the idea of, okay, this was a huge hit for Foley's, we need to strategize this a lot better. He talks with all of these gentlemen, right? He talks with Hobart Taylor, he talks with John T. Jones, and they decide, okay, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna have a group of stores integrate all at once, so we have no opposition. And if at this point, we don't want the segregationists to make a hubbub of everything. And of course, obviously, the flip side of that is we also make sure that the students don't get more of a force there. Because again, their concern is, we don't want this to be Montgomery, Alabama. There was a race riot in 1917 after World War I. That was completely, it was horrid. There were bodies upon bodies like piled in morgues, and they didn't want to have a repeat of 1917. So they decided, Bob Dundee says, all right, this is what we're going to do. Let me talk with the media folks. Let me talk with the newspapers, the TV, and the radio station. And they decide, all right, there's a day you're going to desegregate, but you're not going to report on it but for a week. So no week of reporting that this happened. And he called it, this is the blackout, called it a blackout, media blackout. And again, this is what we call the oddity of Houston. This happened. This is what we call quiet desegregation. August 25th, 1960, 70 lunch counters and stores quietly desegregated in downtown Houston. 70 desegregated in downtown Houston.
And there was no response of the
community? So it took a week, and after a week it was slightly reported, but then it just fizzled out.
But I mean, the people who were going to these places.
How they did it was what the business owners agreed, all right, we're gonna put all these signs, no people allowed, those kind of, I won't say the word, but no people allowed. We'll just put it under the rug and pretend like it just didn't happen.
Right, but I'm just saying
news.
Yeah.
It's just totally, but then when people that work there, they.
Whites refused to go to those places,
Some did, but people just didn't, they just went on, they just continued on. It was a weird kind of like, some didn't go, but most people were like, okay, well.
I want my lunch.
I want my lunch, it happened. That was, again, it just wasn't, because it wasn't, if it had been reported on the day of, there would have been much more opposition. But you just gave it a, people were like, okay, well, this is it. That's it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I don't interrupt too much, but I'm wondering, so I don't know, when was TSU established? How big was it at the time? And what was the relationship of TSU, the president of TSU, to the mayor of the city? I mean,
Excellent. So I forgot the name of, I forgot when TSU was established, but as you know, there was, so the city of Houston wanted to establish 2 public universities. And this is during the time of slightly before what we eventually called the Jim Crow era. They wanted to ensure that there was an institution for Black students and an institution for white students. So there was a junior college that was established that eventually became the University of Houston, which was the whites only college. Right directly next to it was the Houston College for African American students, for Black students. That became TSU, that became Texas Southern University. So at the time, it was, I don't quite remember how many students it is, but the relationship between the president of TSU, Samuel Norman, and the mayor of Houston, because it's a public institution, the institution actually responds to lawmakers the capital. But secondly, Samuel Norman was on this, at one point, he was on this biracial committee established by the mayor. And that the mayor, after he dissolved that committee, was in continued relationship with Samuel Norman. So it was kind of not in a formal agreement, but it was more of an agreement that you're one of the leaders of the city, you're one of the leaders of what we call the black leadership. So he had to have, he was always consulted in decisions. But at any point, whatever kind of committees that were established that dealt with African American issues, he was always on the committee because he was one of the instrumental leaders for that. But yeah, so it became, right, you had these two public institutions that were intentionally different.
It was established in 1927.
27.
It was a Houston Colored Junior College, and then in 1934 it became Houston College for Negroes. In 1947, it became Texas State University for Negroes, and then in 1951.
There we go. All right, excellent questions. Actually, these are great because I'm just going on with the general history. Yeah. So after that, the student movement is just unable to pick up momentum. There's five months where they're just unable to. It was great. The lunch counters are desegregated, but their steam is gone because that was the intention of the media blackout. So Thurgood Marshall was an attorney at the time who actually a lot of what the students were doing was advised by Thurgood Marshall. And he advised the students, all right, if you want to push this forward, there's a recent Supreme Court case that made it that interstate travel could not be denied on account of race. And so he said, you can try to do it that way. So the students decide, all right, let's try this at a different angle. There's this Union Station coffee shop right there in this train station. They decide we're gonna sit in there. So they sit in, and to their chagrin, they were arrested this time around. Now they were arrested, and they were jailed. There's a whole story there. I don't want to go into that sub story, but it ends up happening that 28 students were arrested. They hoped that they were going to get out, that they were going to be bailed, but actually their lawyer decided, no, actually you need money. This movement has no money, and we see the writing on the wall. So they kept him in jail. Actually, he didn't show up in their court date, but he used that to raise up money all throughout the South and all throughout the city. So at this point, while this is going on, they want to try to, desegregate. They want to continue the student sit-in movement. At the same time, the students, again, kind of guided by Thurgood Marshall talks to Sam Nygren, and he tells him, it's interesting that your students can't go to the Majestic Theater or can't go to theaters. Perhaps that's another angle you can get at. You can figure that out. And so the students decide, all right, let's do that. Let's try to sit in. And so they tried, and they were unsuccessful because they were just like standing up. They were trying to get into the ticketing place, or they tried to disrupt the movie. Just didn't work. They weren't arrested. They were just like, go on. So Thurgood said, actually, what would work is if the students actually block the exits. So if they block the exits, then they could get arrested. Because at that point, right, you're not allowed to do that. That actually illegal. And so that actually became that was the other match that struck there. And so by this time, right, the black and white civic leaders are kind of getting the picture of how things are going. So they decide, all right, let's try blackout number 2. So April 1st, 1962, there is another media blackout. And at this point, it was the opening of these coffee shops, the opening of theaters, and the opening of hotels, such as the Rice Hotel and the Shamrock downtown. You have to remember that around this time, right, there's about maybe 2 years ago, right, there are plans to try to get a major league sport here in Houston. Wanted to get a major league sport. But Quinton Meese told the leadership of the city, we're only going to prove that if the league is fully integrated, and wherever they go, whatever dome that they have that you're trying to construct, that is fully integrated as well. And so there was the holdout. All right, we're not gonna allow this until. Right, you agree to it. So they agreed to it. They agreed to fine, okay, and. Yes, it's gonna be a fully integrated league. We're gonna have a fully integrated stadium that happens. And so then some of the black leaders decide, and specifically, in conversations with John T. Jones, they said, you think it'll be interesting, you'll have a fully integrated league. You'll have people like Willie Mays come and they're gonna play a game. But isn't it interesting that they're gonna go to the game, but then they can't actually go to like the Rice Hotel or the Shamrock downtown? It's segregated. And that's when they realized, all right, you're right. So behind, right, the second media blackout is this wider question of sports. How do we, as a city, right, that claims to be, right, this kind of, we are the city of the southern, we are the church, we're the city of the harbor of the southern seas, we're a very fast and rapid moving city. This is the time, right, where NASA and the city of Houston are having their big agreements. And so they decide, okay, we're gonna live into what we're gonna do. So April 11th, 1962, the first major league game goes on without a hitch. It's fully integrated. Perfect day. And so what's happening in this time? So October 1962, right? You have JFK has to send in the troops because there's an old miss. There's an African-American student who's trying to sign up for undergraduate schools, right? We begin to have the movement in Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. And so it's May 1963, and now it's the student union. The students at this point wanted greater desegregation in other establishments in the city. At this time, restaurants and specific movie theaters were still not desegregated. They were still segregated. And so the students decided, all right, we got to hit them exactly where it is. It's May 23, 1963. One of our astronauts, Cooper, had just finished this wonderful mission. And there was a live NASA downtown parade. It was going to be televised. And the students said, all right, we're going to go and we're going to pick it. And we're going to have a select time while the parade is going on. We're going to stop. Some of us are going to stop the head of the parade here. Some of us are going to stop the back of the parade here, and we're going to garner media attention, and we're going to force them to desegregate restaurants and movie theaters. So, quote, at the 11th hour, there is Mr. Hobart Taylor, John T. Jones, the Association for the Houston Restaurant Association, and President Navarrete. They're all on the phone, and they said, all right, we're going to do it. We're going to desegregate. We're going to do this now. And it was done quickly. The parade went without a hitch. None of the parade people realized that if that hadn't happened, there would have been a complete disarray of the complete mess. But again, the media didn't report on this. And for all intents and purposes, that is, if you think about the desegregation of Houston, that's mostly the story there at that point. I'd like to at least give us some, if you have a little bit of time, give us some Christ the King context here. So at this time, right, we actually have, this is from 1959 to 1963, we have the Reverend Earl Bankston here. He's one of our pastors. He leaves in 63. That reason is for another time and another place. And he said this in a letter addressed November 1st, 2005 to our congregation. He said segregation and integration became a hot issue in the mid-1950s, and Christ the King was affected. Augustana Lutheran, our neighbor, integrated, one of the very first in the South to do so. Partially to support Augustana, but also out of conviction, I publicly endorsed integration, a position supported by some of Christ the King members and opposed by others. A few members wanted my sermons to be checked and edited beforehand, but this idea got nowhere with the church council. One time I found a note in my car parked outside the church threatening me, but wisely or unwisely, I regarded this as someone's cruel joke. And we actually have a member at the time, Bridget Jensen. This is from a publication a while back when Reverend Robert Moore was here. She was interviewed by Miss Anna Faye Williams. And this is what Bridget said. Christ the King Lutheran Church was formed at a time, this is around the 40s, right? When the pastor of Augustana Lutheran Church, where we belonged, Pastor C. Strand, was broaching a subject which was very delicate in those years. Texas Southern University had been established and Augustana was located nearby on Chartres and Wheeler Streets. In the spirit of the gospel, Pastor Paul C. Strand thought we should invite our new Black friends to become members. My mother always felt that some members came to Christ the King Church because they didn't want to go to an integrated church. For that reason, my mother kept her membership at Augustana until she died. So in some respects, we're Christ the King was always at an interesting crossroads at this particular time in the life of the country. But I can assure you from at least my time reading through the archives, we've consistently had pastors that have always been on the right side of history. Right, Bergston was one of them. I'm going to give you a little bit about the Reverend Edwin Peterman. I don't have to tell you much. Most of you know Edwin Peterman more than I do.
So can I interrupt one more time?
Yes.
So what about the original, the first pastor of Christ the King? He
Kenneth?
must have been aware.
Larson.
Well, that was Larson.
That's Kenneth Larson.
Okay, so but he must have been aware
At that one, I have no idea.
of
because
why
the
Christ the
records-
King was coming about because of this white flight from Augustana.
Right, that is not in the records I have over there. Yeah, I'll just say it's not in the records that we have.
We left Augustana because there were Black people. I don't think.
Yeah, so I'm saying, I wonder what the fact for that. And
So all I can say is, Earl Bixton and Lawson knew each other well. In that time, when you were called as a pastor, you kind of, it was who you knew. So he most likely did know about the situation, and then he experienced it personally. I think, in some respects, like I said, I may not know about him, but I do know about people specifically during the period when there was integration and desegregation in that particular period of time. And so I like to at least, sorry, I'll just go back to Edwin. I want to end this quickly. Edwin Peterman, while he was training, when he was in Chicago at undergrad, I think, he said this, again, interviewed by Anna Faye Williams. He said, one Saturday, him and a fellow Black student went down to downtown Chicago and tried to order at a Woolsworth counter. There's like a thread there with Woolsworth. They were refused service. I thought it was because they were because the two of us were students. But his friend, after they left outside, took him outside and said, don't you understand? It's because I'm Black. That radicalized. I could understand what was happening to Black people. And this is a personal aside from him. He said, because I have been terribly abused as a child by my peers. I know what it was to be ostracized and to be beaten down. And I have grown scars from that. So Reverend Peterman, right, that is so changed him that was a central part of his ministry. Even when he accepted a call at St. Thomas Lutheran Church in St. Louis, Missouri, he always wanted to work amongst the poor and the oppressed. That he felt called to that. He said, at the time of the civil rights movement, I found myself speaking as an advocate for integration, even to the point of convincing white families to stay when a Black family purchased a home in their neighborhood. And so it was interesting when the president of the Texas district asked Edwin, hey, Ed, you want to consider a call in Houston to a predominantly white congregation, very affluent, quite educated. He was kind of torn because that wasn't the population he was kind of working with. But the day, right? Think of at this point, this is 68, right? 65, he had walked with Martin Luther King and Selma. Give it a chance, right? Blessed him infinitely. You can read the rest of that report by Anna Faye Williams and Christ the King. And I like to also make this point that while Reverend Alan Dieter was not a called pastor of this congregation, 1964 he joins this campus ministry organization that serves the University of Houston, TSU, and Rice University. And he himself, I don't quite know if he knew Ed at this point, but in 65 he also marched with civil rights leaders from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And in '67, when there was a riot in TSU over the death of an 11-year-old Black child, he supported the students in the riots. I would like to end by discussing one institution that we haven't talked about, Rice University, right? We all know kind of the history of Rice University. It was established by William Marsh Rice for an institution of letters and learning, particularly for white men. And imagine this is September 12th, 1962. You're at the wonderful stadium, and there is the president, John F. Kennedy Jr., and he's talking about the great opportunity that Rice has and Houston has as hosting, right? That one day, through this entire institution, we'll be able to get to. And it's really at this time, right? There's a congruent movement going on at Rice that solidifies on September 26, 1962, in a board resolution. It's a unanimous resolution to do two things: to desegregate and to start to charge tuition. And in order to do that, they were to change this initial charter of Rice University. So it was actually objected to by 2 alumni. So there was a litigation that went through the courts, and it occurred that during this time, so this lawsuit was filed April 20th, 1963, to help figure out, to help litigate this and to allow for this resolution to pass. So it happened in August 1963, while this is being litigated, the first Black Rice student was admitted to the university in the math department. He was a PhD student named Raymond Johnson. He was to graduate in 1969. March 9th, 1964, Texas State District Court William Holland entered in judgment in favor of the university. He said the jury unanimously agreed that William Marsh Rice had intended to create an outstanding university through his gift, and that maintaining segregation would make it impossible to carry out this intent. So the university was officially, by its charter, desegregated and now charged tuition to students. September 1965, Jacqueline McCauley became the first Black student to be admitted to undergraduate programs at Rice University. And together with Mr. Charles Edward Freeman, the first Black male undergraduate student, that was when Rice University was, quote, integrated.
So women came first, Rice.
Yes,
And then-
and the undergraduate, yeah, really, yes. And that's it.
Wow.
Any thoughts?
So going back to the media blackout,
Yeah,
were there 2 major newspapers in Houston? Was it the Chronicle and the Post at that time?
if I remember,
Yeah.
yes.
I'm wondering what the editorials were like. Once the blackout was lifted, I wonder what support the papers.
So it's interesting because I think Times newspaper got in contact with one of the editors of the Post. And he said, we found a bunch of Black media, like your blackout in the media. And they got blasted in the New York and in the Times for the blackout, for the media actually not responding or not writing editorials or responding to the desegregation in Houston. Yeah. It's interesting, Dan Rather actually interviewed Eldrewey Stearns. It's one of his earlier things in his career. It's fascinating.
An interesting time. I lived through all that.
That's weird. Someone who didn't just regurgitate everything.
That's great, though. It's just, yeah, I'm so glad we're recording.
Our my hope is that we will have not only Ms. Halcyon Watkins here, but there's a couple of other professors at TSU that contacted me that would love to be here, but they couldn't be here because, for obvious reasons, the Ms. Halcyon had some personal issues in terms of family loss, and then the other teachers just weren't unable to make it for this time around. But they do want to be here. They want to have a panel and have a wonderful discussion with us. All right. Well,
Thank you.
I thank you all. If there's any, you will receive, I will send a link with all of the materials that I had used for this presentation. And I hope that this will be the beginning of many discussions on this.
Yeah,
Thank you, God bless.
thank you. Thanks.
Oh, yeah. It's too bad. You never really. Okay.